All right, welcome. This is Parenting During COVID, Behavior Management. This is session 2. Our first session, we reviewed anxiety management, and now we're moving on to behavior. Our third session will be about self-care. So for those of you who have not met me previously, my name is Lauren Sabella. I am the District Behavioral Health Coach for Reading Public Schools. I wear a variety of hats, including I am the one of the Teapot administrators for our RISE preschool. The Teapot is a teacher pyramid observation tool that we use to make sure that we are following pyramid model practices. We'll talk more about that in a moment. I'm one of our district's youth mental health first aid instructors. That is a course that we have for all of our staff, so that our staff are familiar with how to respond for a young person who may be experiencing a mental health crisis. I'm also our Open Circle coach and trainer. Open Circle is our social emotional curriculum for grades K through 5. I'm also a CPS trainer and coach. Collaborative problem solving is a methodology around thinking about ways of behavior and how to improve behaviors based upon building thinking skills. We're going to talk about that a little bit today. And finally, I'm also a QBS safety care trainer. We have 5 district-wide. QBS Safety Care is our de-escalation training. So again, we'll be talking a little bit about behaviors based on QBS practices. So those are just a little snapshot about some of my trainings and background. I'm also a licensed mental health counselor and a school adjustment counselor. So my experience is mainly in mental health and behavior. So that's just a little bit about me and some of the things we're going to be talking about today. As I mentioned earlier, this is our pyramid model. So we have 2 different types of pyramid models. This is our pyramid model that focuses mainly in our RISE preschool. We have a slightly different pyramid model that we use for K through 12. The preschool model is just broken down a little bit more, but the philosophy is overall the same. The philosophy of the pyramid model, as you see down at the base, in order to have really an effective workforce, we want to make sure that all of our people, places, trainings, everyone feels supported. We want to really build a strong base. And as part of that strong base is to create a nurturing and responsive relationships with our students and really have a nurturing, and responsive environment. We also want to make sure that we have high quality supportive environments for all of our students. That blue color is what we call a Tier 1. Tier 1 interventions are things that we do for all of our students, regardless of individual needs. Those are supports that we offer for all of our students. So those are things that all of our students are getting. Our Tier 2, that green section, would be an example of targeted emotional supports. So if a student was maybe having a particularly hard day, we would give that particular student additional support. And then our Tier 3 interventions, that top tier, is for individualized support plans. So for children who have maybe an ongoing behavior challenge, we would get a little more data collection and we would address that need on a more individual nature. So that's just kind of an overall perspective around our pyramid model practices and how we teach social emotional learning and how we manage behavior support within the classroom. The reason why we're talking about that today is because we want to model what we do at home as well as what we do in school. And a lot of the practices that we're going to be talking about today are based off of the pyramid model. Another factor about the pyramid model comes from building positive relationships. So like I said, that bottom tier is really the base of our supports. And on this slide, you can see kind of 2 different main images. We have the fill a bucket image, and we have the emotional tank image. So if you're thinking more of a gas tank. And the reason for that is I'm going to explain an analogy for both our children and our adults. So the book it says fill your bucket. There's the cute picture of the bucket with all the hearts and stars and glitter kind of coming out of it. That is actually a book. It's called Fill a Bucket, A Guide to Daily Happiness for Young Children. And it's become a pretty popular book among school-aged children. The book itself essentially teaches the philosophy that all day long, everyone in the whole world walks around carrying an invisible bucket. And essentially, this invisible bucket is kind of like your self-esteem. It's your emotional think tank, if you think of it that way. So this invisible bucket gets filled from the very first day of birth. It gets filled with love and good feelings and affection throughout all of our loved ones and people who care for us. So people who smile at us, people who give us hugs, kisses, tell us that they love us, that they care for us, that we're smart, that we're strong. All of these things help fill our bucket. And we can fill other people's buckets by doing the same thing. So building that positive relationship with our children is the first step in filling that bucket. The book goes on to explain that sometimes we can tip out our buckets, or we can accidentally dip into other people's buckets. And that's when we say things that are unkind or unsupportive. So maybe teasing someone, or criticizing someone, or yelling at someone. Those are things that dip into people's buckets and harm their positive relationships. But we can always fill those buckets back up. Filling the bucket is always something that we can constantly be doing. Now, if we're thinking about the adult metaphor of filling a gas tank, we know that as much as we'd like to, we can't just fill the gas tank once. We fill the gas tank and then we drive around, and eventually our gas tank kind of runs low again. So if we're thinking about our own personal gas tanks or our children's buckets, it's something that constantly needs to be filled. And that's kind of the philosophy that I want you to be thinking of as we're going through this training, that we're constantly responsible for filling our buckets, or as adults, we constantly have the need to fill our own gas tanks, right? We need to check in on ourselves just as much as we need to be checking in on our students or on our own children. So building positive relationships is the first piece of understanding and building positive relationships and seeing more positive behaviors. So some tips for encouraging your child. We want to think about how to promote positive behavior. It's much easier to manage positive behavior than it is to manage challenging behavior. I promise you we're going to talk about challenging behavior today, but let's think about the positive behavior, right? Kids playing well together, picking up after themselves, sharing. When we're seeing these things, we want to encourage them. If we're using positive comments and we're encouraging these things, we're more likely to see them. When we're giving positive praise, we want to use these 6 tips. We want to get our child's attention. It's not helpful if we compliment our child, but they never actually hear the compliment. If they didn't hear it, it's like it didn't happen. We want to use behavior-specific language. So instead of just saying good job, tell them exactly what it is that they did that was good. Nice job keeping the sand in the sandbox. Oh, I love how you were splashing and keeping the water in the tub. Thank you for sharing your toys with your sister. These are really helpful things to be specific around what it is that we like that they did. Keep it simple. Try to avoid combining encouragement with criticism. For example, we don't want to say, oh, thank you for clearing your plate without having me to ask you 100 times, right? That's kind of what we call a backhanded compliment, right? When we kind of add that negative onto the positive, we want to just kind of keep it simple and just say, thank you for clearing your plate. We also want to encourage with enthusiasm, right? An enthusiastic compliment is one that is taken a lot better than one that's done with sarcasm or with less enthusiasm. We can also double the impact with physical warmth. So think about a compliment that you could give your little one and then giving them a hug or a squeeze or even a high five. Little ones love high fives or fist bumps. But really adding that physical warmth really amps up the good feelings or the bucket filling as we would think of. And then using positive comments or encouragement with your child in front of others. This is a super powerful one that I feel we forget about or we just don't do as often as we could. Think about the last time your spouse or partner or girlfriend complimented you and how good that made you feel. And now think about your spouse, partner, girlfriend complimented you in front of somebody else, right? Like maybe your parent complimented how clean your house was in front of your cousin, or maybe your coworker complimented you in front of your boss. When we compliment our children in front of another adult or in front of others, it really adds on that impact. So, thank you, Susie, for picking up your toys. Daddy, wasn't that great how Susie picked up all of her toys all by herself? That really adds on the impact. So being really mindful of these things can really increase the positive behaviors that we're seeing in our home. Another way that we want to be mindful about thinking about these behaviors is how we say it is just as important as what we say. So for the little girl on the left, she's doing the dishes. Like we said with those tips, right? Thank you so much for washing the dishes and keeping the water in the sink, right? So we want to be really positive and really specific, right? Not just thanks for doing your chores, because that would be really broad and that wouldn't be specific. And it kind of puts us down almost, right? Like, oh, thanks for doing something you already should have been doing. Whereas thank you for washing the dishes and keeping the water in the sink reminds us that the expectation is not to make too much of a mess. Now, for this poor little girl on the right, she maybe was having a little bit too much fun and she was splashing in the sink and she maybe made a little bit of a mess. So our reaction might be, out of frustration, don't splash the water, you're making a mess, how come you can't do anything right? Now, it's not our instinct to do these things, but life happens, and sometimes we get frustrated, especially when we're trying so hard to keep a clean house and we're trying to teach responsibility, and we have a lot of things on our own mind, but being really mindful about how we say things to our kids is just as impactful about what the things that we're saying. So the little girl on the right, although she's trying to be helpful and she's trying to do her chores, when we say things like that, it makes it less likely that she's going to want to do the dishes again, and it makes it less likely that she's going to do a good job doing the dishes. Whereas the girl on the left is more likely to do the dishes again, and she's more likely to do it in a way that doesn't make a mess. So we really want to be mindful about how we're encouraging our kids and about the words we're saying as well as how we're saying them. When we're giving our children encouragement, here are just some examples about how we can be really specific. So thank you for picking up all of your toys. Or when we're noticing that our kids were good problem solvers, right? We want to use those words. What a good problem solver you are. You were able to, find a quiet activity while mommy was on the phone, right? So different ideas, different things about ways we can constantly be encouraging our child to show us those positive behaviors that we want to be seeing. It's so much fun to play with you. You're so good at sharing, at taking turns, at waiting. Again, the more we can emphasize those positive behaviors, the more likely we are to see them. You were being so kind when you shared your favorite toy, when you handed your brother the crayon. Thank you for using your inside voice when your sister was sleeping. So again, that last one even adds the reason why, right? So a lot of times when we have expectations for our children, we don't necessarily explain to them the reason why. For example, in school, the rule is walking, no running, right? But a lot of times we don't explain to our children why. Why is that the rule? Why do we have to walk? Why can't we run? Why do I have to use an inside voice? So when we add that clarifier, right? Thank you for using your inside voice when your sister was sleeping, it adds more information. It's not too overwhelming and it's not too much information, but it kind of helps to emphasize that that child was being empathetic without even knowing it, right? Not only were they using their inside voice, they were playing quietly, they were being respectful of their sibling who happened to be sleeping. Now, thinking about COVID and what we're going through today, it's really important to kind of take a step back and reflect on our own life. It's simple to say, find the good and reward and praise. But the reality is day to day, if your house is anything like mine, it's pretty chaotic. Daily stress is going to be amplified by COVID stress. For months, we were told to quarantine at home, to not go outside, to not go to parks, to not go to public settings. Slowly, we're opening up more and more to more public places, but we still have to be careful and wash our hands and wear masks, and that can be very overwhelming. As I talked about in my previous training, the level of anxiety and stress that we're experiencing is going to be coming out in our parenting. It's also going to reflect on our kids. So not only are we experiencing and feeling anxiety and stress, our kids are feeling that as well. So it's important to be mindful about where we're at emotionally, especially when we're reacting to our kids and how we're reacting in our parenting style. It's important for us to be gentle on ourselves. We are also living through this pandemic, and we are not expected to be perfect. We need to be gentle and kind to ourselves and understand that sometimes we may say the wrong thing, sometimes we may raise our voice, and that's okay, as long as we're taking that moment to reflect and be mindful and trying to correct it in the future, right? Sometimes we're going to be imperfect, sometimes we're going to dip into our kids' buckets, but we can always refill them. We can always come back and say sorry. We can always come back and give them a compliment. We can always try to look for the positive and look for the good and look for the positive to rebuild that relationship. This is a theory through collaborative problem solving by Dr. Abalon and Dr. Green. They were two doctors who worked together, I believe, through MGH, and they developed this theory called collaborative problem solving. They also wrote a series of different types of books that can be really helpful if you're interested, and I can share those links at the end of the training. But essentially, the idea of collaborative problem solving is based off of the idea that kids do well if they can. And this is a really strong philosophy that I truly believe in. In general, kids do well if they can. Kids want to do well. Even on your most challenging days, I promise you, your child does not wake up and say, how can I make mommy or daddy's life as difficult as possible? Just like they don't wake up and say, I want to make my teacher's life as difficult as possible. Kids want to do well. They want to be good at things. They want to make you proud. They want to do their chores. They really want to do well. So if we think about if a child wants to do well, why is it that sometimes they misbehave? Why is it that sometimes they don't do well? Well, if we think about children and behavior, just like we would think about any other skill, whether that be reading or writing or some other kind of skill that we would teach, we need to think about behavior in the same way. We need to teach positive behavior just like we would teach any other type of skill. So if we think about a child who's struggling with behavior, it could be because they're struggling with a lagging thinking skill. Now, when we think about what a thinking skill is, we're thinking about their ability to think about things in shades of gray. A lot of our children have a difficulty with really seeing things as black and white. Some of our kids have a difficulty in understanding verbal language, and therefore their translation from verbal language into their cognitive skill can also be delayed. For younger children, it can also just be harder to have typical problem solving skills. So being mindful that it could be a skill deficit and not necessarily that they're actually being manipulative or limit testing, or that they're just not motivated to. It could simply be the idea of this lagging thinking skill, right? That something else is getting in their way. So if we think about things as more of a skill, not a will, it means that it can be taught. It means that it can get better. Whereas a child who just simply doesn't want to do something, it's very hard to change their will. It's very hard to change them, to get them to, for anyone with young children can very easily figure out that if a child doesn't want to do something, it's very hard to get them to do it. It's very hard to motivate them. But if it's something that's getting in their way, it's something that is making it harder for them to behave, to be on their best behavior, then there's something that we can do to change it, and there's something that we can do to motivate them to behave the way that we want to, or to see those expected behaviors. So when we're thinking about behaviors, what is it? What does it look like? Typically, when we're thinking about children and behavior, we're talking about challenging behavior. So whatever the challenging behavior that you may be facing, we want to think about why that behavior is happening, because again, behavior doesn't happen in a vacuum. So let's think about the different types of behaviors that you may be seeing in your house. You may see defiance, not wanting to give back an electronic. We may see, we have kids who are jumping around and making a mess. We may say siblings that are fighting with one another, picky eaters. Kids that don't want to wake up, kids who are overtired, kids who don't want to nap. There's lots of different behaviors that we may be seeing in our house. Fighting, arguing, yelling. So when we're thinking about the different types of behaviors, we need to think about why they're happening. So when we think about why does challenging behavior happen, simply put, children engage in challenging behavior because it works. Let's look at these 4 little kiddos right here. They look very, very unhappy. Let's think about why they're unhappy. What could be going on with these kids that they're so unhappy? Well, let's talk about this little friend right here who's sitting in the chair at the table. It looks like he has something in his mouth. I could guess that he is unhappy because he doesn't want to be eating his lunch, or maybe he's happy because he already ate all of his lunch, or maybe he's unhappy because he didn't get dessert. Typically, we see challenging behavior because a child either wants to get something, right? They either want to access something, whether that be food or drink or attention, or it's because a child wants to avoid something. When a child's trying to avoid something, they usually want to avoid either a loud or chaotic environment. They want to avoid maybe a challenging task, an unpleasant environment, or maybe a new or frightening situation. So when we're thinking about challenging behavior, it's important to think about the context of that challenging behavior and what the driver of that challenging behavior is. To better understand challenging behavior, I'm going to teach you the ABCs. The ABCs of challenging behavior stand for antecedent, behavior, and consequence. The antecedent is whatever happens before the behavior that we're interested in. So for our friend who was maybe having a tantrum at the table, the antecedent may be that his mom told him that he can't have dessert after lunch because he didn't eat all of his lunch. The behavior is whatever the child does. So in that picture, the child was slinking down in his chair, he was crying, he may have been yelling, and the consequence is whatever happens after the behavior. So we don't really know what the consequence was in that picture, but we can imagine that either mom gave in and ended up giving him the treat, or mom didn't give in and maybe he got a timeout, or maybe he got excused from the table. Depending on what that consequence was, whether it was a good or bad consequence, is going to affect whether or not that behavior happens again. So when we're thinking about consequences in this context, we're not thinking about the typical consequence when we think about punishment. In this context, consequence is just whatever happens after the behavior that we're interested in. Let's think about another type of challenging behavior. For this one, we're going to talk about tantrums in the store. So for these children, we're seeing a tough time in the store. The antecedent here is that the child sees either cookies or candy and they want it. The behavior is either that they take the candy or take the cookies, and then the consequence is that the parent is saying no. So how we react to that tantrum is going to either decrease or increase the likelihood of it happening again. Now, if this were my husband in the store, if my child were to throw a tantrum because they want candy and he were to say no, he would give in every time. He would give the child the candy because it would stop the tantrum. Now, that's what we call a behavior trap. That's when our behavior is reinforced by their behavior. What that means is the antecedent is the candy, the behavior is the tantrum, and the consequence is getting the candy. So what happens is when the child gets the candy, the tantrum stops. My husband has now learned that every time he gives in, that the tantrum will stop. That means that next time my 3-year-old has a temper tantrum in Target, she knows that she'll be rewarded with candy. Now, if we give her candy every time she throws a temper tantrum, we've now taught her that if she has a temper tantrum, she will be rewarded with candy. My husband is happy because there's no temper tantrum in a public store, and my daughter is happy because she just won candy. But I'm not happy because we accidentally reinforced the idea of if I throw a temper tantrum, I will get what I want. So again, thinking about the ABCs. The antecedent is that a child sees candy in the store. The behavior is that the child yells for candy. The consequence is that the child gets candy. So for this scenario of ABC, the consequence reinforces the behavior. My child now learned that yelling equals candy. So she is going to yell every time she sees candy. We accidentally reinforced that behavior. If we want that behavior to stop, we have to change our behavior. Let's use another example. Let's say as an adult, we're using a vending machine, right? Typically, we put money in the vending machine, we press the button, and a snack comes out. We're happy, right? ABC. Antecedent, we're hungry. Behavior, we put money in the machine. Consequence, we get a snack, right? That is the expected sequence of events of ABC when you reach a vending machine. Now, let's change the consequence, right? We're going to change the consequence so that when we see the machine, we put money in the machine, but this time the machine's broken. We don't get a snack. Our behavior is now going to change because our expected consequence isn't the reward. Now, typically, a calm adult would just say, oh well, and walk away. But for an adult who is frustrated, for an adult who maybe didn't expect that as a consequence, we may be less calm and controlled. Instead of happily taking our snack and walking away, we might hit the machine, kick the machine, or even try to pick up and shake the machine. This is an example of an extinction burst. This is what happens the first time you do not give your child candy after they yell for it in the store. If my 3-year-old learned that she can go to Target, see candy, and yell for candy, if I say no, she's going to yell louder. She's going to have a bigger tantrum. She's going to probably flop on the floor and cry, 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 because her previous experience has taught her crying equals candy. So in order to stop that, we have to change the consequence. We have to change what happens after the behavior. Eventually, she'll learn that crying does not equal candy, and we have to be consistent. So that's where, when there's more than one parent in the home, you need to be consistent about what the expectations are. You need to be consistent about, if our child's going to throw a tantrum, we're not going to reward them with candy. So similarly, the adult, if you put your money in the machine and no food comes out, eventually you're going to stop putting money in that machine. Eventually, you're going to say to yourself, nope, that machine is broken. I'm going to change my behavior. Because after a few times of losing your money and not getting a snack, you're going to make a different choice. And that's how we change behavior. Now, it's hard to do on your own, and it's hard to do at home. Whereas in school, we have a lot of different resources and education around collecting data. We have different resources for collecting data, and we have different types of ways that we can collect data. But that doesn't mean you can't collect data at your own home. And I actually encourage that you do. When we're trying to change a behavior, I encourage you to select one behavior to focus on, and that'll be the behavior that you're trying to change. So let's say the behavior is yelling yelling in the candy store, yelling in the grocery store. Typically, whatever the store is, whether it be Target, whether it be the grocery store, when you reach that checkout counter, there's candy. That's why I use that as an example. So it's highly predictable that when I go food shopping, when I reach the checkout counter, my child's going to see candy. It's highly predictable that when my child sees candy, they're going to cry, or they're going to scream, or they're going to beg for candy. If I want to change that behavior, I have to change my reaction. So in order to figure out what's going to work, I need to collect data. I need to figure out what my child's behavior looks like before they see the candy, when they're looking at the candy, and what happens after. So you can take this same data collection and whatever it is the behavior that you're trying to change at home, whether it be splashing water out of the tub, whether it be knocking over a cup at the kitchen table. What is it that's happening before, during, and after? Is the consequence something that they like? Now, even if the consequence is you yelling at them or you saying no, that's still attention. And negative attention is still better than no attention at all. So sometimes what happens after the behavior can still be reinforcing. Because remember, sometimes the goal of a behavior is to escape the situation. So maybe a child is throwing their food off the table, kind of tossing their food. And then your response to that is that you give them a timeout. If their goal was to escape the kitchen table, then you've accidentally reinforced that behavior. So in order to figure out what's reinforcing, we need to do a little bit of data collection. Going back to how to promote positive behavior, we want to do everything we can to set our kids up for success. This time, instead of waiting for my child to throw a temper tantrum at the grocery store, I'm going to set her up for success. Instead of promising her candy, I might bring a more appropriate snack with me to the grocery store. And I'll explain to her that if she helps me unload the groceries, or if she helps me put the groceries onto the conveyor belt, or if she says, please, she can have a snack. So what I'm going to start by doing is explain the expected behavior. I'm going to say, if you have a calm body and a quiet voice in the store, you can have a treat, right? And that treat will be something that is parent approved versus whatever the candy is that is in the candy store. I'm going to praise any and all cooperation and all of the behavior, the positive behavior that I'm seeing in the store. Remember, I want to keep that positive momentum. Anytime that she's sitting quietly, anytime that she's using a calm body, anytime that she's using a quiet voice, I'm going to be constantly giving her positive reinforcement so that she's able to continue to have that positive behavior. I really want to set her up for success. I want her to see that this is something that she can obtain. I also want to reward her often. So if I know that my 3-year-old's attention span is maybe 10 minutes, I want to reward her every 8 minutes. I want to reward her before her attention span is up. Keeping that positive momentum is going to build her capacity to have a longer attention span. When we're setting expectations for our kids, we really want to stay in the positive. At Rise Preschool, we have expectations telling our kids what to do, not what not to do. So for example, when we want our kids to be looking, we say eyes watching, right? Or we have eyes looking. We're not going to tell them don't look at the floor. We're going to say eyes on me. So remember, tell your kids what to do, not what not to do. Make the expectations clear and simply state what it is that you expect them to do. What does a calm body look like? What does that mean? Hands by your side, hands in pocket? Does that mean that they're wiggling or that they're standing still? What that looks like is going to be a little bit different for the age and the developmental level of each child. So make sure that whatever it is that your child is expected to do, it's something that's developmentally appropriate for them. Again, having age-appropriate expectations. It's not appropriate to ask a 3 or 4-year-old to sit for long periods of time, but we can expect them to wait for maybe a few minutes. We always also want to use age-appropriate language. So we want to make sure that we're checking in with them, that we're not being too complicated with what the expectations are. For especially young children, they have a harder time understanding contractions for words. So we want to be merely mindful about the words don't and can't. It's much easier to tell them what to do and what they can do. So being mindful of these things will make it easier when setting our expectations up for our kids. House rules is another way that we can set up successful expectations. When we're setting up house rules, I encourage you to set up these things with your children. Remember that COVID has made our lives dramatically different for many different situations. So we want to really reiterate what our house rules look like. Have your house rules changed now that the world has changed? Are we a little bit more relaxed on screen time? That's okay. Are we a little more relaxed about wearing PJs? That's okay. When we set house rules, we want to set no more than 5 rules. More than 5 rules are going to be really hard to remember, and they're going to be harder to stick to. When we're choosing house rules, we want to pick rules that the whole family can apply by. Again, we want to state house rules that are stated in the positive, not in the negative. Remember, we want to tell people what to do, not what not to do. And we want to pick rules that apply to many situations. So even if laundry is a big deal in your house, having a rule like always put the laundry in the hamper is a really narrow, really specific rule, and it doesn't apply to many situations. A better rule might be always pick up after yourself, because that applies to more situations than just laundry. Always be respectful. That's stated really positively, and it's general, versus no teasing, which is more stated in the negative, and we want to really make sure that we're staying in the positive. Coming up with house rules as a family is also going to build more buy-in for our kids. When they understand what the rules are, we have a much better success rate on having them follow the household rules. I encourage you to make a fun poster, write them together, sign them, maybe do handprints. This is something that we do at school, and it's something that the kids really react well to, and it's something that I encourage you to do at home. Once we've created our house rules, it can be really helpful for us to practice what they are. Show and tell. If one of your rules is to pick up after yourself, or that we clean up our own space, show them what that looks like. Clean the room together. If you ask your child to go clean their room, that can be a really overwhelming task. Instead, break the task down into smaller pieces. Let's make the bed together. What does it mean to make the bed? Well, in our house, it means that you're going to put all the sheets and blankets on the bed. Once that's done, then we pick up all the stuffed animals and put that on top of the sheets. That's what the bed looks like when it's done. Take a picture of what the bed looks like when it's made, and then you can actually use that on some kind of chore chart to help your kids see what it looks like when the bed is made. Remember, practice makes perfect. Practicing making the bed together over and over again will help build their not only their gross motor skills on how to physically be the ones to be making the bed, but it also will encourage them. It'll show them some pride in being able to do a chore independently, and eventually they'll have a lot of pride on being able to make their bed. Third, remember just to go do it. After lots of showing, telling, and practicing, it's something that you can very easily ask your kids to do after lots of practice. Once they do it successfully on their own, remember to go back to the beginning and praise, praise, praise. Remember again that COVID's going to be a very stressful time, and it's something that unfortunately we may be dealing with for a while. So we want to be really gentle on ourselves, and we want to be really gentle on our kids. We're going to have a hard time, and our kids are noticing the levels of stress and anxiety in our home. So it's not uncommon that we're seeing more behaviors tick up. Starting back from the basics and starting from the beginning of reiterating home expectations and practicing what positive behaviors look like will definitely promote more positive behaviors in your home. Remember that kids and parents do well if they can. Take it one day at a time and make sure that we're not overwhelming yourselves or your kids. It's going to be a lot to expect them to do all of the things that we talked about today in one day. So really break it down. Remember to be kind to yourself. It's going to be a very overwhelming to manage a home in addition to all of the things that are typically happening in your life. And if your kids are noticing that you're feeling stressed out, it may be that you need to take a break on your own. It's okay whether that be to take 5 or 10 minutes to recharge, and it's okay that everybody makes mistakes. We can always refill our own buckets as well as refill our kids' buckets to build that positive relationship. Remember that change is hard on everyone. For a lot of our kids, they don't really understand why they weren't able to go back to school. For them, it's still hard to process that they can't see their teachers in person and that they can't maybe hug family or go see their friends that they've been doing before. So understanding that and comprehending that things have changed can be really overwhelming and scary for everyone. So when we're seeing some of these behaviors tick up, remember that anxiety and stress are definitely root causes in some of the behaviors that we're seeing. And finally, remember that even though sometimes we can feel really alone, that we're getting through this together. We may only have a week of school left, but please feel free to reach out to me, to reach out to your teachers, to reach out to people if you feel that you're having a hard time or that you need additional support. These are some resources that I want to share with all of my parents. The District Behavioral Health website. We also have family resources, community resources, and a page dedicated to mental health well-being. And a lot of these resources were found for the Center for Social and Emotional Foundations for Early Learning. Thank you, everyone, and I'm going to end the recording. If anyone has direct questions for me, I'll be available after the training. I hope you enjoyed this.